All right, so it's 3 p.m. I wish you a very warm welcome to our fourth roundtable discussion of the Arab Center's migration cycle. This session will focus on the interaction between migration and economics within the Arab world at both the state level. So we will look at how states in the region benefit economically from regular and also irregular migration flows, and also look at the institutional level, where we will be more looking at the role of international and humanitarian organizations in this regional migration economy. So today's roundtable will particularly explore the migration diplomacy of Arab states and the way in which migration flows are also used for political or economic ends. And in order to do this, we have invited today four specialists. We have with us Leila Simona Talani from King's College London, Gerasimos Tsourapas from the University of Glasgow, Clothilde Facon from the University of Antwerp, and Julien Brachet from the French Institut for Research and Development. And their intervention will be moderated today by CHAABANE from the American University of Beyrouth and PSL Paris Dauphine. So I thank all of five of you for being with us today. And without further ado, I will hand over to CHAABANE, who will further introduce our four panelists today. I wish you all a very enriching and interesting discussion.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Isabel and the CAREP for organizing this seminar. So I'd like first to introduce our first speaker today, Leila Simona Talani from King's College London. She will speak about the political economy of irregular migration. She's a professor of international political economy in the Department of European International Studies at the King's College London. She became the editor of the Palgrave series on the politics of migration and citizenship in 2020. And then in 2022, she founded the Center for Italian Politics, of which she is now the director. And she was also a Pierre Keller professor at the Harvard School of Politics in 2018. So we will have her present for about 20 minutes, and then we will move on to the next speakers. So if you have any questions, please either write them down in the chat or note them somewhere, and we will come back to the Q&A session when all the presentations have been made. So Professor Talani, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry that I'm not be able to control the slides, so there will be some mess, I'm sure. Anyways, but I'll tell you in a moment exactly what I want to discuss today. So the idea is to talk about the political economy of migration, international migration, and in particular about the political economy of irregular migration, which is obviously one of the most frequent modality of migration from the Middle East to the EU because of a number of reasons, the Fortress Europe and the limits that there are at the entry of migrants into the EU. The whole presentation will be about two elements. The presentation which I have posted is much longer, but I will only talk about two elements. One is what is irregular migration and why does irregular migration exist? And the presentation will be based on the different interpretation of the reasons why irregular migration exists from the theory of international political economy. So the basis will be the three different political IB approaches to migration. And so basically, like just at the beginning, just to say that obviously we don't know exactly how many irregular migrants there are in Europe because they are irregular, so the numbers are difficult to find out. There are various estimates. There's been estimated by the European Commission that the vast majority of migrants, around 97% of migrants, are irregular. At some point migrants from the Middle East and Northern Africa to the EU are irregular at some point of the migratory process. I'll tell you what it means this when I go on with the presentation. But first, let me just say, if we move on the slides into what is irregular migration, what is the definition of irregular migration. So according to the International Office for Migration, irregular migration is the movement of person to a new place of residence, and I'm reading, or transit, that takes place outside the regulatory norms of the sending, transit, and receiving country. What does that mean in practice? So this basic definition already tells you that the definition of irregular migration is legally defined. It depends on regulation. So a migrant who can be perfectly regular at the point of departure and then become irregular in the transit country, in the receiving country, but could even be perfectly regular in the transit country. For example, many migrants that arrive in Turkey, they have the right to go to Turkey, which is the reason why they go to Turkey. So they have the documents to enter Turkey, but they do not have the documents to enter the EU. So if they come, for example, from the Middle East, they are regular at the departure point, regular in the transit country, but they are irregular when they enter the EU because they do not have the proper documents. So the definition of irregular migration depends completely from the legal context, and there are hints that change in the legal context obviously also change the status of the migrants. Let's go down in the next slide, which I should have. How do we explain the existence of irregular migration from the political economy point of view, from the different theories of international political economy? So here it's difficult to say because I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the various theories of IP, but the most, let's say, obvious ones are the realist and the institutionalist and the more critical approach to international political economy. And they all have different assumptions. They also bring to different conclusions in terms of why irregular migration exists. We've already said that irregular migration is defined by the legal system, so it is in a way institutionally defined. It depends on how the institutions treat migrants. However, from some points of view, irregular migration might also not necessarily be unwelcome by the states, despite the various let's say, declaration against migration or against irregular migration. If you look at this phenomenon from a specific point of view, which is the realist approach to international political economy, it might be possible to conclude that although irregular migration exists, it is not unwanted. How do you arrive to this conclusion? First, the realist approach to international political economy takes the state as the main unit in the international system, and basically the state doesn't have anyone above it that can actually either control or influence its decision making. So there is superior non-recognizance. It means there is no one above the state. So it cannot be influenced by the preferences of international institutions or supranational institutions. Plus, according to this approach, the state is perfectly able to define and identify how many migrants they need. So states are able to control international migration. However, if they are able to control international migration, then the fact that the irregular migration exists is a little bit of a paradox, a contradiction, because you would say if there is irregular migration, it means that the state is not able to control migration. There is something which is called a policy gap or a policy failure. The various statements or pieces of legislation in favor of controlling migration or limiting the number of migrants do not work. Let's say the solution of this contradiction from this point of view is simply that the state is only pretending to want to limit the number of migrants, but in reality they do not really want to limit it, or they want to limit only the number. They don't want necessarily to only have regular migrants, but they might also want, the states in general also want to have irregular migration. And that means that this policy failure is not real. It's only at the level of the rhetoric. So there is a mismatch between what they claim, what the states claim, or what the state claims, and what in reality wants to obtain, which is both regular and irregular migration. So when the state says we don't want any irregular migrants, they're not saying the truth to the electorate. Why? They're lying to the electorate because there might be various reasons. First of all, that there is could be some let's say, antagonism on the side of the electorate against migrants in general and irregular migrants in particular, but there could be also some political economy advantages of irregular migration. What are the political economy advantages of irregular migration? For example, the fact that irregular migrants are more blackmailable, they're more controllable, they can be exploited more easily because they have no means to uphold their rights, and also they therefore lower the costs of production inside a specific country, but they also limit the power of the trade unions because they also autochthonous or local labor force is, let's say, the power of the local labor force is reduced, their cost of production go down because they have to compete with irregular migrants, and the power of the trade unions is reduced. So what does that mean? It means simply that irregular migration exists because the state wants it. That is only one idea. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but according to this approach, the realist approach, irregular migration, which is, as we say, legally determined, so it depends on the fact that there are laws limiting the entry of migrants, exist because states do not only want regular migrants, but they also want irregular ones for various reasons that we can discuss if you want. And that means that the famous policy gap or policy failure is only at the level of the rhetoric of the state. It's not real. There is not real policy failure because the state has exactly the number of migrants that they want to have, either regular or irregular. And that's it. This is one interpretation of the reasons why irregular migration exists. There are, however, other interpretations, and we can, I think, move down to the neo-institutionalist approach, which is the other possibility of interpreting the existence of. If you want to move down, please, to the next slide.
Yes, sorry, it's blocked. I need to.
It's blocked. Perfect.
Yeah.
So we don't move it down. Well, okay, fine. I have it here. So what is the next possibility? The next possibility is that this policy gap, which is has been defined as the mismatch between what the state wants to obtain in terms of limiting the number of migrants and the reality of the existence of the irregular migration, is real. It's not rhetorical, but it's real. And it exists. Why? Because in reality, migration cannot be stopped completely by the state, cannot be completely controlled by the state. The state does not have the power to decide how many migrants they want in their territory. And the reason why this is the case is because of the existence of legal institutions and also laws, both national but also supranational international laws that attribute rights to the migrants. And these laws are upheld by the judicial system. So basically, migrants, when they enter the territory of a democratic state, like Western democracies, acquire a number of rights, including the right to exist, so the right not to be killed, the right to be to have their health protected, the right to an education of their children, the right, many rights, not to be like tortured, and so on and so forth. These are all either human rights or social rights or political rights that exist within this democratic state and cannot be limited. Therefore, if states limited those rights, for example, by shooting migrants at the border because they don't want them to enter, or not giving them the right to educate their children or stuff like this, they would be entering what is called the liberal paradox. So they will not be liberal anymore. There is a paradoxical position of the democracies. Democracies have to guarantee rights to everyone, including migrants, and migrants are attracted to liberal democracies by the existence of those rights that we just mentioned, but also by the fact that there is a judicial system that protects those rights. And therefore, for this reason, there is a sort of pull factor represented by the judicial system and the existence of rights, which limit the possibility of the state, the ability of the state to control migration. And that cannot be eliminated. So the policy gap is real, and it is a policy gap at the level of implementation. So the laws limit the number of migrants that should enter the territory of the state, but also once the migrants have entered, even if they are irregular, they are protected by the state itself. And so those like laws that limit the number of migrants cannot be actually implemented. And this means that there is a policy gap. And migration, therefore, exists from this point of view, which is the neo-institutionalist approach. Why? Because democracies are liberal democracies, Western democracies are liberal democracies, that they guarantee rights even to irregular migrants, and therefore irregular migrants are attracted to the territories of those nations, and there is a judicial system which actually guarantees them. This applies also at the supranational level, in the case of the European Union, especially after the Lisbon Treaty. The European Court of Justice is in charge of protecting the rights of migrants, a certain number of rights, and these are upheld by the legal system of the European Union. There are human rights, or the Declaration of European Human Rights, which apply to everyone, including irregular migrants. This is why irregular migrants are attracted to the territories of the European Union, and this is why there is a policy gap. So there is a mismatch between the declared number of migrants that the state wants, or the EU states wants, and the de facto real number, which includes irregular migrants. The third approach is the more critical one. It's called the transnationalist approach, for reasons that we can discuss. And basically what it says is that the policy gap exists, but it's not at the level of implementation. It's at the level of the efficacy of the laws that limit the number of migrants. And in practice, what that says is that the state in the globalization era is unable to control migration. So there is no way in which the state can control migration. There is no way in which the state can decide how many migrants they want on their territory. And the reason is that because migration is part of the structural changes, structural let's say, modifications which happen because of globalization, and it is the consequence of the existence of imbalances in which the globalization is put in practice. And those imbalances are both social and geographical ones. In geographical terms, there are a number of regions in the world which are marginalized from the global political economy, and because they are progressively more marginalized, we can discuss it. This progressive marginalization of certain regions of the world from the global political economy acts as an incentive for not only migrants to migrate, mass migration, but also for brain drain. And brain drain actually exacerbates the marginalization of those areas, of which, if you want to go even the data, the Northern Africa, Middle East area belong. So this is a marginalized area of the world. That means that there is an increase in the number of people who want to leave those regions to go towards the global north, and in particular towards the European Union, because this is a structural phenomenon. The state cannot control it, cannot limit this phenomenon. The only thing that the state can do by imposing laws that limit the number of migrants that should enter the territory of the state, by securitizing the border of their territories, that can only transform regular migration into irregular migration. This is the reason why irregular migration exists. The reason why irregular migration exists is because the state is imposing laws that limit the number of migrants. And given the fact that migration cannot be stopped, this imposition transforms regular into irregular migrants. This is called the substitution effect of laws, of the legal system that limits the number of migrants and creates problems. Why? Because irregular migration is increasing the insecurity of the state. First, because all of those, the biggest majority of those migrants that enter the territories irregularly at a certain point, and I'll clarify later of the migratory process, they do it through the help of organized crime. And that this is proved. There are various, I even wrote a chapter of my book talking about this. There are various reports of the European Commission. 90% of those are helped by organized crime, either smuggling them in, trafficking them in, giving them fake documents, allowing them to remain after even if they enter legally through the like visa or tourist visa into the country, they can stay usually through the help of organized crime or being involved in activities which are not licit ones, like, for example, working for the underground economy. In fact, it is proved that the underground economy represents a very strong pull factor for migration, for irregular migration, for the very easy reason that irregular migrants can only work for the irregular migration, for the irregular economy, for the underground economy, because they do not have the documents to work for the regular economy. So there is a sort of vicious circle or a vicious cycle between marginalization and stigmatization of immigration, which is obviously irregular migration, and that leads to political backlashes against immigration, and that leads to, for example, populist radical right-wing populist party, and so on and so forth. So there is all of a process which is put in place, of a vicious circle which is put in place by the need to securitize the border, that instead of increasing the security of the state, actually decreases it by making irregular migration the only way to enter the state, with all that means in terms of involvement of organized crime, marginalization, stigmatization, and so on and so forth. We can elaborate on this later on. So, and I think I will conclude. I don't need to talk about all of the rest of this incredibly long, basically this incredibly long presentation, but the conclusions are, I had also the modalities of entry of migrants. I don't think I have time. Do I have time? No. But we can ask a question at the end. So basically the conclusion is the following, that irregular migration is a phenomenon which is defined by the legal system of the state that imposes the laws to limit the number of migrants. Does it work? It depends on what kind of theoretical approach you are adopting. For the realist, in reality, in a way, it doesn't, but it does, because it doesn't work because you still have irregular migrants. But in the reality is that the state wants irregular migrants, so this is why you have irregular migration. For the institutionalists, those rules do not work because migrants are attracted by by the rights attributed to them, even if they are irregular, by liberal democracies, and also that are upheld by the liberal states judicial system. And for the critical transnationalist theorists, they do not work. These rules don't work, and the state cannot control migration because migration is the consequence of globalization. Is a structural phenomenon. It cannot be stopped, and by imposing limits to the number of migrants that should enter a country, you simply transform regular into irregular migration, and with all that means in terms of making it more dangerous and more for the migrants, but also for the local population for various reasons that we can discuss. I think I have exhausted my time precisely because I started at 2:03. And I'm ready to answer questions whenever it's necessary. Did you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Talani, for this very interesting presentation. As I mentioned in the beginning, we will leave all questions till the end of all presentations. So if anyone has a question for Professor Talani's presentation, you can either write it in the chat or keep it till the end. We will now move to our second presentation, which is by Gerasimos Tsourapas from the University of Glasgow. He will be presenting on the commodification and migration diplomacy in the Arab world. He's a professor of international relations at the University of Glasgow. He's also the chair of the Ethnicity, Nationalism, and Migration Studies section of the International Studies Association, as well as the editor-in-chief of Migration Studies, a journal published by Oxford University Press. He works on the international relations of the Middle East and the broader global South, with a particular focus on the politics of migrants, refugees, and diasporas. So we're very much looking forward to the second presentation. And as I mentioned before, you also have around 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jad. Let me try to share my screen. Can you see it okay? Hopefully it works.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you again, of course, Jad, for chairing. Thank you to Isabel and to Karep for putting together this wonderful roundtable. I know all of the rest of my panelists, and it's a true honor to be here. Simona's work I've been following since I was a PhD student. and her pioneering research, and also, of course, Clothilde and Julien, their respective works on Lebanon and also on Sub-Saharan Africa, paves the way for, I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. I will talk for 20 minutes, I promise, on commodification and migration diplomacy in the Arab world. I'll tell you what I mean about this in just a second. Very quickly, the picture on the right, of course, is the Zaatari camp in Jordan. And I use it in order to clarify the main theme of my topic, my presentation, which has to do with the extent to which migrants and refugees in the Arab world are being commodified. The Zaatari camp in Jordan was built expressly by the Jordanian government in order to render Syrian refugees visible to the international community in order to attract additional economic aid. So the debate and the decision to encamp Syrian refugees rather than to not has to do a lot with the Jordanian government's decision or urgency to attract material aid from outside. And this is a theme that you'll see goes on throughout what I'll be talking about. So the theme here of the debate is how do we understand the political economy of migration in the Arab world? I take a slightly different route than Simona. I look from an international relations perspective, and I argue that what we are observing is this ever-increasing transformation of migrants and refugees into economic resources. We've stepped away from looking at these vulnerable populations from an international law, a humanitarian or a human rights perspective, and increasingly we look at them in a more cynical, neo-realist or power politics type of manner. And drawing on Karl Polanyi's work, of course, I argue that this can be best encapsulated by the term commodification, and in particular migrant and refugee commodification. And I'll explain how this works with a brief intro into these processes of refugee rent-seeking that I argue have come to dominate the political economy of refugees inside the Arab world, as well as ongoing processes of migration diplomacy. So in terms of rentier states and what I call the Arab refugee rentier state, anyone familiar with political economy debates is aware of the concept of rent. The concept of rent developed in the 1970s. I'm particularly drawn to it because it emerged from the Middle East. It's one of the key contributions that the Middle East has made to the study of political economy and broadly political science, I would argue. So it's not something that's imported from the West, but it's something that emerges in Iran in order for researchers to make sense of the impact of oil or other resources on states in the Gulf and state-society relations. The argument being, of course, that oil rentier states develop a different type of economy because they're able to draw on oil rent, on selling oil as a commodity abroad and benefiting from this unearned income that is flowing into state coffers. I take this in a different route and I repurpose the concept of rent into forced migration and argue that something very similar is happening with refugee politics in the Arab world. Much like oil rentier states, we have this phenomenon of refugee rentier states, essentially states across the Middle East that host forcibly displaced populations and which have come to rely financially on external material aid or refugee rent linked to their treatment of these groups. So, for instance, in the context of Jordan, the Jordan Compact and the amount of money flowing into Jordan make Jordan a refugee rentier state. Similarly with Lebanon, and perhaps the archetypical Middle East state of refugee rent being Turkey. In the aftermath of the EU-Turkey statement or EU-Turkey deal of March 2016, the Turkish state secured 6 billion euros worth or promised worth of European aid flowing into Turkey. And this is what I try to conceptualize as refugee rent. For those of us that might be a bit more theoretically inclined, a key difference here, of course, is that oil rent is procured by other states that are willing, that are eager to share this resource. Refugee rent is procured because other states are not happy to receive this. So the aid that flowed into Turkey was not meant to encourage Turkey, of course, to open its borders and allow refugees to enter European territory, but the exact opposite. So this is how I conceptualize refugee rent. And I argue that it paves the way for also processes of migration diplomacy, cooperative and coercive processes in which migrants and refugees are really increasingly being featured in the foreign policy making of the Middle East and more broadly in world politics. And let me get a bit more into the implications of this or the repercussions, given that this is a session on the societal aspect as well as the state aspect. One of the things I'm arguing in my research is that refugee rent is based on how a host state treats refugee populations. And as a result, I argue that it creates novel ways for states of the global south, or in this case, Arab states, to become dependent on international donors. So it creates novel linkages of dependence between the center, the rich Western center that does not want refugees, and the poorer periphery that tries to manage the influx of forcibly displaced population groups. How this works out, one example is the case of Jordan, where I did research back in 2016, 17, 18. One of the things that emerges in Jordan in the run-up to the Jordan Compact, this agreement of over 700 million euros flowing into Jordan in order to help it cope with the Syrian refugee influx, is that Jordan was pressed to agree to provide employment opportunities for Syrian refugees living within its territory. So the Jordanian government, eager to receive refugee rent, agreed to provide 200,000 employment opportunities for Syrian refugees. Of course, it was quickly evident and I think almost immediately evident to anybody working on the political economy of the Arab world that Jordan was unable to find these 200,000 employment positions. About 2 years later, Jordan had only offered about 60,000 work permits to Syrians. So it was at an impasse because it was dependent on external aid, but yet it was seen as not keeping its end of the bargain. So what ends up happening, very, very interestingly, is that in this growing tension between the Jordanian state, the Ministry of Labor, and the international donor community, Jordan somehow has to find 140,000 more jobs for Syrian workers. So what ends up happening is that it starts giving out multiple work permits to Syrians, but even more interestingly, it starts to essentially harass or imprison or deport other vulnerable migrant or population or refugee populations within the kingdom in order to make room for Syrians to take up these jobs. My first book was on Egypt, so I always keep an eye out for Egyptian migrants in the Middle East. And the Egyptian workers, most of them working irregularly in the Kingdom of Jordan, were the first to suffer from the steering that was taking place as the Jordanian state, based on this agreement with the international community, was highlighting the needs of Syrian refugees and de-highlighting or marginalizing even further the vulnerable migrant and refugee groups that were already present in the country. So that's one implication of this type of dependency. But I argue that it goes a bit further than this. I would say that refugee rent seeking tends to skew host state policies towards attracting external funding. So it actually leads a lot of these states in the Arab world, Jordan, Lebanon, Tunisia, Egypt, to essentially develop novel ways in which to attract external funding. One example I already mentioned at the beginning, this is the decision to construct refugee camps in Jordan. Unlike, for instance, what they did after 2003, where Iraqis were not encamped, Iraqis that sought shelter in Jordan, the Jordanian state, in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis, decided to construct refugee camps. Partly, it has been quite convincingly argued in order to attract more economic aid and to make these populations visible to international donors. So it's quite an interesting phenomenon in terms of the effect that refugee rent has on on vulnerable populations and their encampment, right? So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Another political economy effect is the artificial inflation of statistical figures on forcibly displaced populations. And in a way, this shouldn't surprise us, because if the international community links aid flowing into Arab states that host refugees with the number of refugees they host, then there is an incentive for the states to augment or inflate the number that they hold in terms of forcibly displaced populations. Lo and behold, this happened in Jordan. Jordan at some point held around 650,000 Syrian refugees, whereas the Jordanian state was arguing that actually it's more than twice as much. So the Jordanian policymakers were arguing for about 1,300,000 or even more. And this, of course, is a tactic to attract more international aid, but I argue it's a dangerous tactic in terms of artificially inflating something that might cause phenomena of xenophobia, of racism, of attacks against vulnerable populations like the refugees. So this is something to keep in mind that links perhaps to Arab refugee rentier states' narratives of crisis and state incapacity. One example here, because I only have a bit of time, King Abdallah in Jordan, one of the things that the state would repeat throughout the Syrian refugee crisis is that, well, because of Syrians, unemployment in Jordan is skyrocketing, our health sector is saturated, schools are having a difficult time, we can't take it anymore, right? And this is something that was mirrored in Lebanon in terms of then Prime Minister Hariri, who would repeat this kind of narrative of crisis and impending collapse. Lebanon is on the verge of a breaking point, and of course Hariri went as far as to put a number in terms of the amount of money that Lebanon wanted per refugee. And in many ways, if you take a step back, these are negotiating tactics, right? In terms of these states trying to procure more international aid. But at the same time, this is a narrative that has dangerous repercussions in terms of how these refugees are treated domestically, how a narrative of them contributing to certain problems that are structural. For instance, look at Jordanian unemployment. These are things that we need to problematize in terms of how international aid or refugee rent may actually produce unintended consequences in the domestic political economy of these states. In terms of consequences, one of the things that I identified in my research is this growing normative and substantive encouragement of using refugees for material gain. And I'm sure in terms of foreign aid, Clothilde will speak much more on this than I, but let me just give a quick bullet point to identify this process in which back in 2015, Lebanon decides to implement a residency permit for all Syrians living in Lebanon, each of whom had to procure $200 in order to get this piece of paper. Anybody familiar with Lebanon would know that this is a lot of money. Anyone familiar with the Syrian refugee crisis knows that this is exorbitant. About 70% of Syrians in Lebanon live below the poverty line. So this is a fee that could not be paid. And what ended up happening is that those without documents were arbitrarily arrested and subject to another level of refugee rentierism, as they had to bribe security officials, police officials, in order to avoid prison or to get out of it. So what you see is a two-tier system of rentierism in which the state secures this $200, and then sub-state actors also come in to take money out of the poorer refugees that are unable to pay for this fee. Something very similar happens to Jordan. In Jordan, back in the day, they introduced this bailout process in which, if you remember, Syrians in Jordan were placed in camps and they were not allowed to leave, with the sole exception of if they were able to find a Jordanian citizen that could sponsor them, well, they would be able to leave the camp. What ends up happening, the UNHCR did some research on this, is that essentially Jordanians were able to get around $500 per Syrian refugee that were desperate to leave the refugee camp. This is a very interesting phenomenon that shows us the extent to which rent is linked with citizenship and identity politics. I would link this, for instance, to the Gulf, the importance of oil rents and how oil rents essentially highlights the importance of being a citizen of Saudi Arabia or Kuwait in terms of the kafala system and the power that you have over non-citizens. This is something that in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis was replicated in Jordan. And of course, it diffused beyond Jordan to Lebanon, where sponsorship went up to $1,000. It was sold at airports and so on and so forth. So you see this commodification taking place not merely at the state level, but at the sub-state level, as citizens of these refugee rentier states seem to benefit from the plight of refugees. Last slide, because I only have 5 minutes left on migration diplomacy. And one of the things that we as researchers should look at is, well, who benefits out of all of this, right? And I would argue one of the interesting things here that we need to always keep in mind is that refugee rent essentially is tied into this normative support system that Western states, including the European Union, have traditionally granted to autocratically minded Arab regimes. A lot of refugee rentier states are also functioning as buffer states, right? In terms of the stability they offer to the European periphery and their willingness to serve as bulwarks against refugees coming into Europe. And in many ways, this is not a new tale. It goes back to Gaddafi in Libya, but it keeps replicating itself up until today in terms of what's happening in Egypt and the Sisi regime there. More broadly, I argue that there is what I would call a diffusion effect of commodification and coercive migration diplomacy. What happened in 2015-2016 with Turkey appears to be not the exception to the rule, but rather a paradigm that keeps repeating itself in terms of the mini migration crisis that took place between Morocco and Spain, another migration crisis that took place in 2020 between Turkey and Greece, or the ongoing negotiations between Tunisia and the EU today, in which coercion and the management of refugees seems to be quite central. And this, of course, and this is something that perhaps Julien will touch upon, there's a wider diffusion of this across Africa in cases like Kenya, in Rwanda, but we also see it in places like Belarus, even Greece. My own research shows how Greece has engaged in refugee rent-seeking in recent years vis-à-vis the European Union. So arguably, we have a proliferation of this. We have a proliferation of refugee commodification, this exceedingly common language of deals, compacts, and essentially material concerns replacing humanitarian or legal stipulations regarding how we care or we should care for forcibly displaced peoples. So in my last 2 minutes, just a conclusion. I had two quick quotes, and I'm cheating a bit because I'm including Turkey here, which is not an Arab state by any means, but it does serve as quite an interesting example. This is a month before the EU-Turkey deal was signed. President Erdogan is quoted as saying this to a group of what I imagine is an astounded senior officials in the European Union, and he said, well, we essentially hold all the cards. We can open the doors to Greece and Bulgaria anytime, and we can put the refugees on buses, right? So how will you deal with refugees if you don't get a deal? Will you kill the refugees? And this, I think, highlights this normative disjuncture and this very critical point in time where the European Union as a normative actor is pitted against other states that are more willing to engage in such strategies. And what's worrying, perhaps, is that this kind of language seems to travel across the Arab world. In my interviews and in others, we see this over and over again. Jordan was looking at Turkey. I have a Jordanian official going on record saying, well, we really should have blackmailed Europe like Turkey did, right, back in the day. And that does not bode well in terms of what's to come in refugee governance globally and in this kind of normative shift in the political economy of migrants and refugees towards refugee rent-seeking. I'm running out of time. My last point would be to argue that rent, as originally encapsulated in political economy, and as I use it in the refugee rent, is value neutral. And this is partly why I like the concept, that there is no kind of moral aspect to this. It examines and it describes a phenomenon. But refugee rent seeking and how we distribute these rents is something that we should be really careful about in terms of the normal and ethical repercussions. As essentially we see this diffusion of the phenomenon arguably becoming a global norm, right? Not merely in the Arab world, not merely in the Middle East, but more globally, that should concern us in the ways that forced migration is or should be managed. And with this, at 21 minutes, actually, I'm sorry for the extra minute, Jad, I'll stop.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and for everyone for sticking with the time. We will, so again, if you have any questions for Professor Tsourapas, you can type them in the chat or you can note them for the end of all presentations. We will now move to our third presentation by Dr. Clothilde Facon, who will talk about the political economy of refugee aid in Lebanon. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher in political science at the University of Antwerp, and she was a former student at the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, and she holds a PhD in political sociology from the Université Sorbonne, Paris Nord. So thank you for joining, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will just check if I can actually share my screen. Oh, sorry. Is it working? Can you see my screen?
No, not yet. No.
It started to share, Clothilde.
So sorry. Oh, okay. Is it good now? Can you see the PowerPoint, just to be sure?
Not yet, and it also says that we have a very bad connection with you.
No? Oh. Wait, sorry, just... Well, I don't know. I don't think I can share it, actually.
Clothilde, your connection is very bad. I suggest maybe to turn off your video so maybe we get a better sound across.
Okay. Okay. Is it better now? Okay, I'm just not sure I can share the screen. I mean, it's not working.
You have the hand.
Am I a co-host?
Yeah, you are.
To be able to share, but it's not working, right?
Otherwise, what we could do and what I suggest, maybe we can take Julien first so we can check, Clothilde, whether I can get your PowerPoint on, and also to fix maybe your connection a little bit, and then we take you at the end.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, will that be okay?
If you don't mind, Julien.
All right, so Jad, maybe if you don't mind to introduce Julien, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll be introducing Dr. Julien Brachet, who's at the Université Paris 1 Panthéon Sorbonne, and he will talk about the political economy of human containment and with the case of sub-Saharan migrants in Libya. He's a researcher at the Institut de Recherche pour le Développement. He works mostly on economic and political dynamics in the Sahara and the Sahel, where he has carried out long-term empirical research. He focuses on migratory flows, trade and transport network from a historical perspective, and studies that try to grasp the ways in which intra and interregional relations are organized. Dr. Brachet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jad. So, no worries, I'm not going to try to share my screen because I have no slides, but it's not that bad for me to chat now because following Gerasimos' presentation on the modification of migrants and refugees, I'm going to address the question of the political economy of migration in Libya by the back door, starting with a video that caused a stir a few years ago by showing images of what were denounced as slave functions. I'm not going to show the video, but just to briefly describe it, knowing that it is just the first video among many others that have followed in international news. And my point here will be to discuss the qualification of slavery with regards to migrant situations in contemporary Libya, and to show that we might in fact quite often be in front of other forms of captivity, such as dead bondage or forced labor. And this distinction will help to shift the blame for the migrants' plight from local culture to the international political economy, and it will grant migrants a degree of agency that blanket condemnations of slavery often deny. It will also open up more general questions about the links between labor, mobility, and captivity, and about the link between state and non-state systems of political control. The video I'm talking about, and you might have seen it, it was published by CNN in November 2017 under the title People for Sale. It was advertised as, I quote, an exclusive report on how migrants are being sold by smugglers in Libya. The first shaky footage appears on a dark courtyard with three young black men, and an Arabic voice recites figures while the English commentary explains the scene. And I quote, "A man addressing an unseen crowd. Big, strong boys for farm work," he says. 400, 700, 800. The numbers roll in. These men are sold. You are watching an auction of human beings. End of quote. The video cuts to a car driving around Tripoli in daylight, and we finally meet the reporter, Nima Al-Bagir, a Sudanese raised and educated in Britain. And the video takes us to Tariq al-Sika Migrant Detention Center in Tripoli, which was then officially run by the Libyan authorities, and more precisely by the DCIM, the Directorate for Combating Illegal Migration. But like many migrant detention centers in Libya, it has since come under control of local militias. This center has all the exterior trappings of a prison: bars, controlled entry, guards, and we see dozens of black men, mostly sitting on the floor, waiting. And Nima, the journalist, again, says, I quote, "These men are migrants with dreams of being smuggled to Europe by sea. It is hard to believe that these are the lucky ones, rescued from warehouses like the one in which we witnessed the auction." And the camera zoom in on one of the migrants, a young man from Nigeria called Victory, and the journalist declares Victory was a slave. Answering her direct question, Victory confirms that he has been sold. He and other migrants point to their ankles and forearms, exhibiting traces of beating. We then meet a man presented as the supervisor of the detention center. And Nima specified that he's working with no international support. And this man, Libyan, turns to the camera and says in English, "I'm suffering for them. What I have seen here daily, believe me, makes me really feel pain for them." He says quickly that the Libyan authorities have no evidence of slave auctions, before Nima concludes in adding, I quote, "But we now do. CNN has delivered this evidence to the Libyan authorities, who have promised to launch an investigation so that scenes like these are returned to the past." End of quote. And the past Nima refers to, and that makes for the symbolic potency of the video, this past is that of slavery in the Sahara, of course, but also in the US, as in fact some of the images provided, such as the zoom on the migrants' wrists and ankles, as if they were showing traces of shackles, these images make more sense in an American context than in a Saharan context. And this CNN video went viral. It led to street protests throughout the world, and it was discussed by leading instances of the UN and the EU. It resulted in the UN sanctioning of a handful of human traffickers, but also in increased financial and technical EU support for the DCIM, but also for the notorious Libyan Coast Guard and port security, and for the Libyan General Administration for Coastal Security, all responsible for the internment and subsequent mistreatment of migrants in the first place. This support has since continued despite the fact that these Libyan authorities have been accused many times of many sorts of crimes against migrants. This is why one can consider that simply denouncing migrant captivity in Libya as slavery partakes in a discourse of depolitization and doesn't help to make sense of the current situation, as it replaces political and sociological analysis with unquestionable moral imperatives. In doing so, it makes individual migrants' trajectories and motivations unintelligible, and it extracts local realities from the global context and hides international collusions and shared structures of oppression. This, in turn, calls to mind the colonial situation, where the putative fight against slavery was put forward to publicly legitimize a colonial system that was in fact structurally reliant on institutional racism and different forms of forced labor exploitation, including slavery itself. Instead, we need to get the many ways in which different forms of captivity are intrinsic part of political productive and unproductive regimes in the area, regimes that are contained within state institutions or not. And we need to understand how they are in fact bound up with the same international political institutions that are called upon to suppress them. And the first step toward this is precision in our analytical language. But given the political and security situation in Libya, it's extremely difficult to undertake independent long-term ethnographic fieldwork there. This is why I will mostly draw on interviews I conducted in Niger, Chad, Tunisia, and France, and on current reports published by NGOs, IOs, and UN agencies, but also on in-depth ethnographic knowledge of the wider region that I have acquired in the last 2 decades. So the core question that emerges from this material is that of the creation, negotiation, and denial of the value of individual lives in a context of structural scarcity of people and wealth. Because Saharan economies have always had to import people and have mostly done this through a regime of captivity. Depending on who they were, or at least on who they successfully claimed to be, captives could be valuable for their labor, as in slavery, or valuable through their privileged social connections, as for hostages, for instance, or for a mixture of both. And their status could change over time, and captives could play an active role in negotiating such changes. Similar logics versus today as both ransom-taking and forced labor continue to have a certain importance for Saharan economies. But today, these regimes of scarcity are directly confronted with their opposite, which is an implicit doctrine of human surplus that is put forward by international institutions. Most migrants are caught in the interstices of both and have to try to make the best of them. That is to say, they have to try to convince people locally or internationally of the value in order to be able to pursue their own life projects, but also often in order to simply stay alive. So I will now try to highlight one point of my general argument, which is about debt bondage as a price of migration through contemporary Libya. So anybody consulting the CNN video I mentioned, if you have some time, you might be tempted to scroll down from the first video and look at a second one in which Victory describes his experience in more detail. And I quote, "As I was sold, they demanded a ransom. The pusherman in Niger, I gave him money. He did not pay. So they said, since he did not pay that money, they sold me. I was there. The person who came to buy me gave them my money, the money I owe. They ask you to pay money. From a week, they will start beating you so that your money will come quickly. I was there for 8 months before I paid my money, and I went out." End of quote. In other words, Victory paid for some or all of his journey in advance to a broker, but this broker was dishonest and did not pay the drivers who took Victory to Libya. Or this is at least what the drivers said. Hence, on arrival, he owed them his fare, but could not pay. They held him captive for 8 months until he had managed to raise the money. And in fact, Victory describes what has become common practice in Libya since the beginning of the war in 2011, after the fall of Gaddafi regime. Since then, many migrants prefer paying for the transport, not at the moment of their departure, but on arrival in Libya, which means that they can travel onward even if they do not initially possess the ready money to do so. And it also minimizes the risk of being abandoned in the desert. And as migrants generally prefer to travel without cash or without too many cash due to the current insecurity situation of the Trans-Saharan roads, they need to find ways of raising money as soon as they get to their destination. And they might call home for cash transfer, they might ask a friend locally to pay for them, or look for work to raise the money. In all these cases, it will take some time before they can pay up. And meanwhile, the drivers, who are generally from the Southern Sahara or the Sahel, these drivers cannot or do not want to wait. And their best option is to sell their passengers' debts to local residents, who against a cut undertake to get the money from the migrants in due course. This they do through any means available to them, including hiring them out as a forced labor, selling on their debt, forcing migrants to ring home to ask for ransom payments, and various forms of physical violence, including sexual violence, rape, and torture, which might even be filmed to put pressure on relatives back home. In the absence of any other possible guarantee, the migrants themselves are held as security for the debt. And this is what happened to Victory, who was forced to phone his family, asking them to send money to pay his ransom. And this strategy failed to yield enough. He was set to work. And Victory managed to reimburse his debt 8 months later, and was then free to go until he was caught by Libyan police in Tripoli as a pawn in quite a different game. And there is no doubt that this system puts migrants in terrible situations of vulnerability and exploitation that might easily fall within the contested definition of modern slavery. No doubt also that labeling them as such, as modern slavery, might draw salutary attention to their plight. Yet I think it doesn't really help us to understand what is happening on the ground. As we have seen, Victory is not recounting a story of enslavement, in which he himself would be the object of commercial transaction, and from his captor's point of view, his value would be reduced to his biological existence. But he is more recounting a story of debt and ransom, in which his value as security for his own debt derived from his particular social ability to make the money come quickly. And what are sold here are debts, not people. People's captivity is limited in time, and their labor belongs to them, as otherwise they could not use it to pay the debts. So to conclude, I would say that this discussion about the precision in our analytical categories might look like academic nitpicking, but I think it's not, as it has broader implications. And for one, it extracts people or ills in Libya from exotic customs, and it situates it squarely into contemporary migration practices and policies that severely restrict avenues of legal mobility to people from the global south. Indebtedness, however dire its consequences might be, is not condemned by international legal agreements and almost universally shared moral outrage. It is instead at the heart of the global moral economy and of the liberal emphasis put on individual choice and accountability. Conceptually, debt partnership is in many ways the opposite of slavery, as one attempts to cash in on family connections, while the other presupposes the cutting of all social ties to recreate a willing laborer whose only recognized social connections are those of dependency. It doesn't mean that debt bondage can never be transformed into slavery, of course, or that one has not often been central to the other. But it means that the passage from one to the other implies an additional loss of status. Individual captives need to find ways to fight against this loss by making themselves valuable to their captors. And they do this mostly by insisting on their particular capacity for labor and on their social ties, both back home and locally. In other words, by insisting on their value as a person. Historical slavery betrayed the logic of long-term investment. Slaves were often incorporated into households for several generations. They were rare goods acquired at a huge expense of wealth or risk, and this usually meant that some care was taken of them. And today's migrants, on the contrary, are plentiful and transitory. They travel on their own accord, they are captured on their way, but usually released after a maximum of wealth has been extracted from them as quickly as possible. They are squeezed dry, sometimes to the point of death, but not accumulated. And their captivity tends to be counted in months and rarely seems to exceed a couple of years. And the absence of care they are subject to is at times horrifying. This is why the practices described in the CNN video and elsewhere in many media as instances of slavery can be better understood as debt bondage, prison labor, and hostage-taking for ransom. As such, and like slavery, they are part of a long-standing regional tradition that establishes a close link between different forms of captivity, wealth creation, and labor exploitation, but they cannot quite as easily be relegated to particularly unpalpable forms of local culture. Instead, they are all linked to the long-standing inscription of the region into a global political economy and regimes of inequality. They are therefore both intrinsically modern and intrinsically international. And they are no better or worse than slavery, but they open up different avenues of analysis as well as different strategies of survival to those imprisoned within them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Now we will come back to Dr. Clothilde Facon's presentation, who will present on the political economy of refugee aid in Lebanon. And so this will be our last presentation. And after that, we will open the floor for questions and the discussions. Dr. Facon, are you ready to present?
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I still cannot share the screen, but because it's been deactivated, I think I need to be co-host again. It says that oh yeah, okay, good. Okay. 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 Did it work now?
Yes, we can see it. I mean.
Okay, so I will present on the political economy of refugee aid in Lebanon. And basically my presentation will include two parts. Like first, I will present the political economy of refugee aid, and then the specific role of Gulf states within this political economy. So just to give a brief outlook of Lebanon in 2024, you have an estimated 1.5 million Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees, which gives the largest number of refugees per capita in the world. 80% of the Lebanese population lives now into poverty. The local currency lost 99% of its value. And so the humanitarian system I will talk about, that was first designed to cater to the needs of refugees, is now designed to address also the needs of the host population. And the aid sector in general in Lebanon brings a lot of criticism and debates. So I will talk about that after, but on NGOization, the idea that these systems in a way keeps the system, maintains the status quo and the political status quo. Before 2011, I want to emphasize that the Syrian presence in Lebanon was seen through the prism of Syrian workers. And basically we went from a situation where their presence in Lebanon was acknowledged in a migrant economy to what I will call a humanitarian paradigm, or a paradigm of crisis making. So we need to keep in mind that before 2011, thousands of Syrian workers were present in Lebanon, including seasonal workers, and they were working mainly in agriculture, construction, and this comes back to a series of bilateral agreements that were passed in the 90s between the Lebanese and the Syrian government. And these agreements implemented an open border regime under which Syrians could travel freely to Lebanon and work in Lebanon. And at the time, the border between both countries was characterized by porosity and fluidity. You have the work of Elisabeth Picard on this topic, and Kaufman. They talk about this border as a gray zone, prone to interaction, exchanges between different social groups. And the work of and Elisabeth Picard have shown the deep interconnection between both countries. But even after 2011, when Syrian refugees came to Lebanon, they kept working in the country. And the October policies, were passed in 2014, and they increased the control from the Lebanese authorities. So they were mentioned before, but they include measures to halt the Syrian inflow, encourage Syrians to return, and monitor and control the presence of Syrians living in Lebanon. And so basically the legal framework governing their presence shifted from a preferential to a discriminatory regime, making access to the job markets, to housing, to documentation particularly difficult or sometimes even impossible. And those precarious social and statutory conditions have prompted many refugees to return to Syria. But so for Syrians, Syrians still living in Lebanon and still working there, their work remains sometimes connected to long-standing networks of labor recruitment. So I'm thinking, for instance, of the workers in the BK, and she shows that their work and their presence can be understood by abstraction from the previous framework from before 2014. And basically, the presence of Syrian refugees in Lebanon can be analyzed through the concept of invisibility bargain so that was coined by Geoffrey Pug, but it means that refugees are present and somewhat tolerated in the country as long as they're economic producers, as they do not contribute to economic loss, and as they remain politically and socially invisible. And so I want to show how we went from depicting the presence of Syrians in this migrant and economic framework to what I call the paradigm of crisis making, or the humanitarian paradigm. And so that a shift in paradigm that was perceptible, like in policies, in discourses, in the media, and in particular in the discourse of international humanitarian organizations. And so that humanitarian discourse sort of concealed the reality of Syrians working in Lebanon before and after 2011. So the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has been the primary international actor for the response, also with the World Food Programme and UNICEF, and the most visible. And it sort of became symbol of the international response in Lebanon. So some academic work on the UNHCR has shown that its rationality is based on what we can call a sedentary bias. So that's a concept from Bakewell. So that bias conceives of mobility as something abnormal, as a symptom of a problem. And so mobility in this sense is an issue that should be solved. And so that's sort of like the rationale that UNHCR relies on. And another aspect of UNHCR like worldview is the essentialization of the difference between refugees and migrants. So UNHCR reifies the distinction between refugees and migrants. And something that's also particular with the UN, the Lebanese state was completely bypassed by international aid. So in many countries, the UNHCR, for instance, would try to sort of create or improve a national asylum bureaucracy. But this is not what happened in Lebanon. UNHCR has not tried to set up a proper national administration in charge of handling the refugee crisis. There is like a state minister for displaced person, but its role is very much symbolic. And so that's because the Lebanese state is perceived as too weak or absent or corrupted. So we have a system where the money is sent to international organizations, and then part of the money is sent to implementing partners, like local NGOs. And so Elisabeth Carpi, on her recent books, talks about the emergency machine, because we have this system where organizations should at some point think about ending their programs, but they don't. And there is a lot of money at stakes, most of the time about well-paid labor offered to international staff. So that's sort of comes to the problematic around NGOization. So by NGOization, I refer to the institutionalization, professionalization, and demobilization of movement for social change. And according to the critical scholarship on NGOs, there is strong synergy in the spread of neoliberalism and the rise of the NGO sector in the second 20th century. And so NGOization is a depoliticization of social action, and it's seen as a mechanism that facilitates the disengagement of the states from welfare function. NGOs fill the vacuum left by a retreating state. It diffuses political anger and frames as charity what people should have by rights. And Indian writer Arundhati Roy say that NGOization altered the public psyche. But in Lebanon, the existence of NGOs is obviously comes from way before the Syrian crisis, and it was particularly strengthened during the 50s when President Fouad Chehab launched a vast development plan and delegated part of its social aspects to a civil society organization. Then with the civil war and different refugee waves arriving to Lebanon, these local NGOs have strengthened their network. And now there is an estimate 5,000 NGOs in Lebanon, but that's, I mean, we don't have an actual estimate because the Ministry of Interior does not really handle any registry. But the Syrian crisis has then brought to the country a new humanitarian market, which established a monopoly on many humanitarian aspects of an economic aspect of the Syrian response. And with the current crisis, the NGOization logic in Lebanon is pushed to an extreme level because we're not even talking about NGOs completing the state services for refugees, but about like NGOs replacing the state for both refugees and the host population, as there is like now in Lebanon a complete absence of custodians of the public good. And so even after the blacks, during the post-recovery process, the absence of the public authorities was very striking. And so even in those like very extreme humanitarian crises, the situation remains the same. And then NGOization is also an economic process because it has brought a new humanitarian market to the country and a new economic fabric that has expanded with the crisis. And I will mention this after, but this has increased social polarization in Lebanon. So I want to talk about this humanitarian sphere as a humanitarian market. I will try to be quick, but there is a recent tradition in the literature that I call the radical critique of humanitarianism that's sort of like distance itself from a normative approach of humanitarian institutions, but look at them in terms of power interest and look at their everyday functioning and try to sort of like deconstruct their cognitive bias and their power relationship. And then you have even more recent studies that look at the aid sector as a proper market, an economic market with financial interests and internal and discriminatory practices among staff. Thinking in particular of the book of Carboni on the humanitarian economics. And so Cooley and Ron say that the aid sector represents a new capitalist and transnational system of governance, employing hundreds of thousands of individuals, driven by a willingness to defend their place within this global meritocracy of suffering. So the humanitarian market in Lebanon is very much representative of these quotes. It's extremely unequal. We have $10 billion that have come to Lebanon in support of the RCRP since 2011. So the RCRP is this plan that was designed to sort of coordinate between the Lebanese government, international organizations, and local organizations. And 80% of this money is sent by European countries, the USA and Canada, and 85%, and that number is actually increasing, transit directly through the UNHCR, the World Food Programme, and the UNICEF. And only 4% of that money is sent directly to local NGOs. And most NGOs are actually excluded from the system because they cannot comply with their administrative and managerial standards, sometimes because they're too small. But it's actually unfortunate because those smaller NGOs tend to be closer to the recipient communities. But that system will rather favor like business-oriented NGOs. So in this context, donors have the ability to impose their agenda and encourage more like humanitarian and quantitative outcomes. So that system sort of like favors like apolitical NGOs. So foreign donors also impose their so if we look at more of the job aspect of this political economy, foreign donors impose their requirements for hiring staff. So obviously those are like related to degrees and like the languages spoken, so that favor a very specific transnational class and elites. Also, due to the high mobility of international staff, there is what we can call a lack of institutional memory or institutional amnesia. And that sort of like increase this dynamic of international organization sort of imposing preconceived solutions to Lebanon and to the refugee crisis. Still in terms of political economy, something that is very present now is this idea of a brain drain in favor of a depoliticized NGO sector, in the sense that now in Lebanon, the NGO sector and the international organization sector is one of the few that still offers jobs and jobs in dollars. So that sort of like diverts some part of the Lebanese population that would otherwise be involved in more like political activities or activities actually working to sort of change the structure of the system. And that's a criticism that's, I mean, it's very hard to put data on that, but that's a criticism that's very much present in the debates in Lebanon. I will try to be more quick. And just to conclude on that aspect, the aid system in Lebanon is perceived as a system that accommodates the sectarian elites. So first, because of all those aid conferences that started with the end of the civil war. So those are seen as like a way to sort of support financially the elites. And the part of UN support has actually been targeted by resource hogging. There is a 2021 investigation from the Thomson Reuters Foundation that showed that 1/3 of the UN money had been had been basically lost to banks selling the local currency at highly unfavorable rates. And generally speaking, even with the crisis, even after the blast, the foreign donors and international institutions have been very shy in terms of openly criticizing the Lebanese political class. So I will go very quickly on the role of Gulf states within this political economy. So maybe more quick. Yeah, I will pass that. So these are data on Gulf aid in Lebanon, so from OCHA. So these are just the contribution from Gulf countries, so Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, but through the UN. And so that's actually a very small portion of Gulf aids to support Lebanon. But even if we look at those numbers, Kuwait is the 13th donor. Saudi Arabia in 2022 was the 6th donor. So they actually, the four of them, very prominent contributors to the UN response. And their model of humanitarian aid is like sort of like a mix of a move towards institutionalization, but at the same time, they still have this model called the Khaliji model that shows more flexibility, more engagement with local actors, and less institutionalization than foreign donors. So they do not participate in the Lebanon crisis response plan. They do not engage with the Lebanese authorities. But their model of governance is more direct, based on two levels. So from the donor states, the organization, to local structures that are oftentimes Islamic charities, religious institutions, or even sometimes political parties. So I won't detail, but those are like the main actors, so the main organizations, Gulf organizations, and for the four countries. And I put the name of a few charities and NGOs receiving Gulf funds, but there are actually thousands in Lebanon. And so the support of Gulf aid to Syrian refugees has been through many short-term missions during winter, but also more like long-term development activities like education and infrastructure. Something that is very striking when you do research on the humanitarian sector in Lebanon is the fact that they are very visible in specific parts of Lebanon and completely absent in others. But the fact that their visibility is increased by the fact that they still operate in a very bilateral manner. And so I gave this example of a quote from a municipal councillor from Baalbek, who was talking about the Emirati camp, the Saudi camp, the Kuwaiti camp, and then the UNHCR camp. And so that's, that shows how those bilateral way of operating actually increases visibility. Overall, their humanitarian support was still very much based on a form of religious and identity-based message. And that's actually interesting because these I did more research in 2021, 2022, and their network of religious organizations and partners have actually received more and more funding, and funding to the UN has remained the same. So yeah, I don't have much time, so I think I will pass quickly on that aspect. So to conclude, one aspect I think that would be a good avenue for further research is the idea that we could study the link between Gulf countries' restrictive migration policies and their humanitarian support to refugee hosting countries like abroad, and whether we could see that in this paradigm of border externalization. So Gulf countries have among the highest amounts of migrants per capita in the world, 90% of the population. In Qatar, it's 99.7% of their workforce. She has challenged the traditional view that these migratory policies amount to a lack of policy or control. So she says that usually we see their migrant policy as like a sort of laissez-faire, but she instead talks about a form of migration management and migration used as a political tool. So she used the concept of illiberal transnationalism because of very strict and repressive policies inside Gulf countries. And she talks about the trade-off between a weak control of flux and a strict control of stocks. And her work actually resonates with the work of Hitman. So he doesn't use the concept of externalization, but he does establishes a link between the very high support of Gulf countries, in particular Saudi Arabia, to Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and their fears of socio-economic threats, their fears of Syrian refugees basically coming to Saudi Arabia or other Gulf countries for many different reasons. So he talks about fear of social protest, of political instability, and demographic anxiety. So I found that idea quite interesting. And yeah, just as a general conclusion, contrary to what we have seen in other different case studies, there is in Lebanon no clear-cut homogenization of the humanitarian sector, despite all those power asymmetries between Western actors and Lebanese NGOs and Gulf organizations. So thank you. I hope I wasn't too long. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and thanks again to all panelists for very interesting presentations. So I've compiled a few questions and remarks myself just to kickstart the discussion. And then we will move on to get questions from the attendees. Already we have two remarks by Ms. Berna Habib on the question and answer section. If the panelists can read them, and maybe you can type an answer directly or comment when we come back to this. So my questions for Professor Talani, for the first presentation, it feels like from your intervention that the EU and developed economies are kind of stuck, quote unquote, with irregular migration. So what would be your concrete policy recommendations in this regard in a few words? I mean, you don't have to be exhaustive, but given the analysis that you've put in a very interesting twist of the story in a way, what are the concrete recommendations for the frontier management policy? My second question for Professor Tsourapas is kind of more also a remark, is that I would extend your definition of rentier analysis for the states to extend it to a rentier economy kind of framework, where not only there will be benefits from direct trends, there will be also indirect economic advantages, where, especially from exploitation. So by maintaining in host countries a status of exclusion of economic and social rights for the refugees, you basically contribute to exploitation in terms of extracting housing rent, extracting free services, child labor, and also depressed wages, because they're not able to negotiate formal contracts or to organize into syndicates and what have you. So I would like to see your thoughts also quickly on the broader definition of rent to include exploitation in that perspective. And also another idea that I had in mind when listening to your presentation is that obviously these regimes that are benefiting from rent are doing it, and you mentioned it in the conclusion, that they're doing it with collaboration from more powerful and allies, especially in the West, that would like to keep the refugees there in a way. So they're kind of acting as agents for them, and kind of contributing to a better border management, if we can say this. But what do you think about this hypocrisy in terms of no sanctions, no controls, continuing to sign trade agreements and collaboration agreements, and looking away from this exploitative and rentier environment? On the third presentation, which came in fourth, but I'm going through the order of speakers, Dr. Facon's presentation on the aid sector in Lebanon. A few comments that I'd like to react to. The first thing is that the NGO sector in Lebanon, of course, we have a lot of NGOs registered and kind of active, but there is a kind of a market concentration of NGOs among very big NGOs, big actors. And most of them are international NGOs that actually saw their role increase substantively during the refugee crisis after 2011. And here we're talking about NGOs that handle basically cash assistance and humanitarian aid directly for refugees, contracted by the World Food Programme, by UNHCR, UNICEF, and others. So I don't think we can talk about NGOs in general. I mean, we have to talk also about the fact that you have a monopoly of NGOs and oligopoly in a way in that sector. And that has also special implications. My other comments on Gulf aid, actually, it's much more varied than what you described. There is a lot of funding going on from Gulf countries directly to the CDR, the Council for Development and Reconstruction, either bilateral or through the Arab Fund for Development and other regional Gulf funds, which gave major loans for the CDR for infrastructure and also hospital construction and other projects. And most recently, there's been discussion to increase the safety net contribution of these countries directly also to the state. So I would think it would merit to be extended, the view about the Gulf view of Lebanon and other Arab countries where you have refugees, in terms of not only fear of internal or repercussions on their own populations in these Gulf states, but as more a view of, I would put it as in a kind of a more positive view about increased Arab collaboration, because many Arab countries in the Gulf want to play a bigger role in terms of through the regional cooperation, thinking about Saudi Arabia and the competition with the UAE, but also the view that they want to revive the almost dead Arab Unity project and its institutions, specifically the League of Arab States. So if you read the recent meetings, declaration, I've been very much going into these documents from the League of Arab States, you would see a different Gulf country perspective emerging, especially in the last 3 years. And the turning point was the recent Gaza war, where you have a very big change in rhetoric among, especially the Saudis. I'd like also your views about that. And lastly, for Dr. Brachet, I have questions about, you had a very nice perspective about qualifying the term of modern slavery in specifically Libya and the Sahel. And again, my question would be, I mean, even if we requalify the analysis, we're still talking about humans that are suffering and vulnerable in a major problem of human rights. So what would be a concrete policy recommendations for hosting countries and collaborating countries, other than just deploying more or funding policemen with EU money just to shoot at them, basically? I mean, do we have other tools that can be developed based on the framework you described that is focusing on the debt issues that these societies would have? Thank you. So these are my questions as to kickstart the discussion. Maybe we start with Professor Talani.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's good. So no, thank you for the question. I understand it's a very logical question after my presentation. So, and I do actually have an answer. And the answer for me is that basically if you cannot stop migration, the only way out of this irregular migration paradox is actually to allow more regular migration. That's the answer that I would give, which is basically opening the border. And here the debate is between eliminating the border or opening the border. And I'm in favor of opening instead of eliminating, because opening the border means actually checking who is entering in a much more effective way. than when you close the border, because you can actually allow them in by taking all information and everything, and also control the flows of the migrants. So maybe direct them or have, conditions like learning the language or other conditions can be applied to the regularization of the migratory flows. So the idea is that basically, in any case, you still have a lot of migrants, better to have them regular than irregular. That's the answer that I will give to your question. And that is actually the policy that would implement if I were. But it's got a lot of advantages as well. Like, for example, in countries that have a very high level of the population getting older, so they have older population. They also allows, if you have regular migration flows, that allows to have a fiscal base, which is a higher fiscal level, sustain the retirement of a local population, and they have more innovation and more productivity, because by the definition, younger people are more innovative and productive than the older. So you really resolve a number of problems. And plus, there is the whole debate in political economy about the increase in the number of migrants, which is always adding a bonus to the growth rate of the economies that receive migrants, and all of the discussion about increasing productivity, increasing GDP, and so on and so forth. So there is no doubt that the only way out of this paradox is to open the border for me.
Thank you very much. I think what you said opens up even more discussion, but we'll leave it till after.
Yeah, let's open it.
Professor Tsourapas?
Sure. Thank you very much, Chad. Excellent questions, and I'll try to also respond to the question on chat. I would say that you're absolutely right. So I'm expanding it. I'm expanding the concept of refugee rentierism slightly to look at mentalities. So I talk about a refugee rentier mentality that permeates the state, but also local actors and individuals across the Middle East. But yes, the logical continuation of this would be to look at the economy as a whole, right? The issue here has to do with data more than anything else, given that, as it has been brought up here as well, there is a degree of informality there. There is stuff that we cannot measure precisely, so that creates an issue. But anecdotally or empirically, perhaps, it is there. One of the things, again, using Turkey rather than an Arab state, but in Turkey, for instance, the AKP has benefited tremendously in terms of how Syrian refugees were actually introduced to the workforce in Turkey in many ways, and were able to essentially bring down wages. A lot of people working on the political economy of the Turkish state have identified the links between the economy of the Turkish state in recent years and the influx of Syrian refugees. So there's a lot to unpack there, I think. Absolutely. The hypocrisy question is there, and perhaps I'm a bit jaded, I don't know, but it was there for me all along. And anybody looking into this kind of normative power Europe debates from 10, 15 years ago, it was always there that Europe is always torn between being a normative actor and being a realist actor, right? So I think by looking at where this money goes, it actually paints a rather bleak picture of a group of states that are quite keen to securitize this. But I think we're preaching to the crowd. I don't think anybody in this room needs to be convinced that Europe is, how did Simona put it? A fortress Europe, right? This kind of mentality has been there. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but I completely agree. On the excellent point about Marder, whose work I really like, yes, whoever wrote that question, absolutely. I think that we really need to be careful on the terms, and I'm guilty of this. So I've shied away from calling for the weaponization of migration or migrants as weapons. This kind of dehumanizing rhetoric, I think, is problematic. So we need to find a new kind of language, and we need to also be mindful of the power of categories when we talk about these things, and how Western ideas tend to infuse into these categories that might not make sense to the rest of the world, or even to Arab states that are not part of that haven't signed the Refugee Convention, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Just a quick Side note on this is that we're also torn as researchers studying something that is quite cynical. So I see it in my work, and I try to distance myself from it. But there's also, in terms of researcher positionality, a very interesting kind of tension there, because you do see this happen all the time. You do see states in the Arab world, states in Europe, using dehumanizing language, putting numbers on people's lives. All of this thing permeates the media discourse, the policy discourse. So I don't have a clear answer to this, and I'm happy to hear anybody's thoughts to the extent to which, well, we hold, we're supposed to speak truth to power, but we also, by talking about these things, do we normalize them or not? This is I think, a very interesting question that I'm still grappling with, to be honest.
Great, thank you very much. We'll move to Dr. Facon, and also, so if you can answer, you have a question actually from Ms. Berna Habib on the question and answer, also a question about the NGO mushrooming after the crisis, and also the role of advocating for asylum policies as an answer to these issues.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you for your questions and remarks. In terms of the off-market concentrations, obviously this is something this is really clear. I didn't go into all the details between the UN agencies, the international organizations, and then the different type of national and local organizations. But yes, the UN agency, I mean, UNHCR, for instance, half of the projects are implemented either by UNHCR, either by NGOs, and the other half by national NGOs. So there is still a very strong monopoly and concentration. But what I wanted to emphasize is that like a big part of national and local NGOs are completely excluded from the system. They're not even eligible to get any international funding, but they still sometimes operate, but in a very different manner. So this is what I meant when I said that there is no clear-cut homogenization of the sector. And regarding Gulf aid, thank you. Your remark is absolutely right. Like I know that their funding to the theater and other bilateral instrument has increased. I was really focusing on support to Syrian refugees specifically. So that goes more through the case relief, the MISC Foundation, and the different recreation societies. But obviously, if you're looking at the bigger picture, and that's very interesting, I think also of Qatar, who's been supporting the Lebanese army, Saudi Arabia, who's sort of negotiating with France for the political dialogue. So that's a very interesting, like fascinating developments to watch. And so the last question was whether NGOs could play a role in advocating for asylum policies, right?
It's the remark online about
I don't see it.
You can see it, so I can read it for you. So the remark was that NGO mushrooming after the Syrian crisis was also the reasons behind the argument of the fact that you have a push towards nationalization of Syrians in Lebanon. And she's saying that we may need to advocate for clear policies for asylum that address the Lebanese fears and a clear and transparent aid disbursement policy. What's your reaction about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And actually, that's something that I've heard a lot from local organizations, that they say that they would like to focus on advocating for a proper right-based framework. But it's very hard. And you have organizations trying to do so. There is, I think of Aleph, there is a Migrant Community Center. There are organizations trying, but UNHCR has sort of established a monopoly on legal protection, any legal protection issues, but they actually do not do any legal protection because they are not allowed to do so by the Lebanese state. And that's a complaint that I've heard a lot that a local organization would want to try to do legal protection or like to advocate for a proper like framework, but it's very difficult because you have on the one hand international organizations sort of denying them the right to do so and not funding any sort of not this type of project because they're perceived as more political than humanitarian. And then the Lebanese state, which is this entity that's impossible to advocate because the power is concentrated and it's not very democratic in nature. So that's an excellent point. And about NGOs mushrooming after the crisis, I actually I've heard this a lot, and also the issues of many NGOs that were funded just on the basis of all this foreign funding coming and then sort of just trying to receive some of that funding. But I think this is also a very interesting phenomenon. To be honest, I never came across any quantification of that phenomenon. But that's very interesting. It will be also interesting to see whether those NGOs do still survive now, or if they were just working for a few years, or whether they're still operating. But thank you for those questions.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Brachet. So if you can respond a bit to my comments, and also you have a question from Maybrit Alpes, who's asking you talked about connection between state and non-state forms of control in the Linden context. Studying cross-border entanglements between state and non-state actors will be central to a research project we will start with 4 other researchers in May on expulsions between Lebanon, Turkey, and Syria. Based on the other presentations today, are there points of geographical comparisons that sparkle your curiosity? We can.
Yep. Now I was just thinking, interesting question. Yeah, probably. I'm quite curious, generally speaking. I will see. I will first answer your question, Chad. So why do I attempt to requalify what is happening in Libya, not as slavery, but as debt bondage or prison labor or whatever? For me, it's a way to, first of all, it's a way to better understand the social reality of the situation and its historical roots in Libya. And this is really what I'm interested in first instance. Then, as I said, it helps to avoid any cultural explanation about, like, if what is happening would be a kind of a traditional thing in Libya or in the Sahara, in between Arabs and Black Africans, but slavery, historical slavery in Africa, and this kind of cultural explanation. And it's a way to put it, to put the suffering we are talking about straight into the framework of contemporary international migration policies that produces it first and foremost. It's not a question of old slavery. It's a question of policy. Then debt bondage or prison labor are the results of the closure of legal ways to migrate out of the continent for most of the African population, and even more and more within the continent, but that's another discussion. And finally, I think this distinction about the words we use helps to condemn clearly the cooperation of the EU with militias, with Libyan authorities, do not follow any kind of international rules or agreements in terms of migration policies or treatment of migrants in Libya. So it's a way to condemn this cooperation that is quite often justified under the guise of fighting slavery, because slavery is an unquestionable moral imperative in Europe. We have to fight it, we have to do something, and we can deal with any kind of partner if it's a way to fight slavery. Then if it's not slavery, what is it? Is it still possible to cooperate with these militias or whatever? especially as we have many evidences that, of course, the militias, but also Libyan authorities. So behind Libyan authorities, there are plenty of groups, but first and foremost, the Directorate for Combating Illegal Migration, the DCIM, I talked a bit about in my presentation, but also the Libyan Coast Guard and Stability Support Apparatus. All these entities have received technical, logistical, and monetary support from the European Union and its member states for the interception and return of migrants, even if we know it has been proved that crimes against humanity were committed against migrants in places of detention under the actual or nominal control of these Libyan authorities. And I am using the term crimes against humanity because this is what a UN Human Rights Council report stated just a few months, not a few months ago, but last year in 2023. This is the way they qualified what was happening in these retention centers ruled by those authorities. So can we still continue to cooperate with them or not? That's the question. A few answers to your question. Then about curiosity, I don't know. Yeah, I'm sure it would be really interesting and productive to compare what is happening in Libya, which is really specific because, as you know, there is no one government or one state in Libya at the moment, but two in East Libya and West Libya. But despite this specificity, it would be probably very interesting to see what is happening in other contexts, in other national contexts, in between this link between non-state actors and state actors in this kind of dynamics. That's it. Now.
Great, thank you very much. I don't know if from the attendees anyone wants to ask a question or intervene.
Jad, maybe I do have a question for Simona, if she's still with us. She was talking when responding earlier to you about the positive effects also on economies when we let migrants in. Maybe can you maybe elaborate a little bit on this, because this would also be a nice transition to the next roundtable that we run, where we will look a little bit more on the positive effects also of migration to host countries' economies.
Yeah, no problem. I can do that. So basically, there is a more complete consensus in the political economy of migration, in particular on labor migration to receiving countries, of the contribution of migrants to receiving countries in terms, and this is done by economists, so it's not my research. I'm referring to people like Perry and others. And so the idea, and also some of my colleagues now, like Jonathan Portes and other colleagues of mine, that they work on it, that basically what happens, they call it the bonus of migration. What happens when you have more migrants, especially if they are younger people than the local population, and obviously even if the level of skills is higher than the level of the local skills, but this is not a condition, because even at the lower level of skills is exactly the same. You have an increase in the, first of all, increase in the productivity of the economy, because of the fact that younger people have more innovation, more innovation-oriented. And if you think about like the use of new technologies are obviously easier for younger people and stuff like this. But also you have an increase in generally in the GDP, because you basically, what you do, you increase the cake. And by doing so, you also increase the possibilities for redistribution also to the local population. The only downside that some economists point to is the possibility that you can have some pressure for on the wages of the people that produce the same or they do the same activities and the same. But that's very debatable. For example, there are economists like Borjas that they say that this is the case, but they've been demonstrated in a number of occasions, including the case of the Muriel boat, all of the people coming from Cuba, the Cubans that in the 60s moved from Cuba to the Florida, whether you had or not this reduction of the wages of the local population in a very specific location where the Cubans arrived. And it's been calculated that this effect lasted a few years, just like a couple of years. And then after 10 years, not only the wages were had caught up, but they were higher. And this is related to a phenomenon that happens that the migrants, even if they have the same skills, move the job activities of the local population to other activities that could normally are higher skilled. And there is a very specific case, which has been quoted in a number of occasions, that refers to Italians and Italian women in particular, that since when you had like the carers coming from outside Italy to take care of the elderly and the younger generation. So that can come from Morocco, or before came from Eastern Europe, and now they're coming mostly from Morocco and from the southern Mediterranean countries. What you have is that you freed women from those activities, and they could actually enter the labor force at a higher level of skills than the one they were performing when they would stay at home. So you overall increase the productivity of women, of Italian women, but also generally the GDP. So the economists actually talk of a bonus which is added to the economy by the increase of migration, and this is basically endless. So there are some economists talk about the trillion dollars that weighed in the economies of the receiving countries through the migration process and so on. It's completely consensual. There is very few. One of those is Borjas, as I said. The most of the implications, which are negative implications, are understood as being political ones, but not economic ones. The political ones being represented by the political backlash, what Roderick talks about, and also Borjas talk about, the fact that you can have hostility towards people which are different from you, and that can create xenophobia, racism, and stuff. But from the economic point of view, there is no disadvantage. Actually, there all is a positive sum game, always. And I'm not the one to say it. I've wrote a number of things about this. If you want, I can give you some references, but also these people wrote.
I would be keen to hear more. I don't know whether, Gerasimos, maybe you have more information. Do you think that this argument that Simona is just making would also hold true for the Gulf countries? Because we listened to Hélène Thiollet, and Clothilde, maybe you can also jump in, because she intervened in one of the previous sessions. And Hélène, she was mainly given the opposite point of view by saying that those countries, they don't really need migrants, and I think that was also coming out from the presentation by Gerasimos. So do they really have an interest to open their borders and to let them in, or is your argument then not holding, or notwithstanding this Gulf-centric approach to the question? I don't know whether maybe Clothilde and Gerasimos, you could maybe jump in and elaborate on this.
Yeah, no, I'll let Clothilde talk, but very, very quickly, I would say that I'm fully supporting Simona's point. I think beyond purely political economy, there's also a demographic aspect here. I don't know if you mentioned it, Simon, but particularly in Europe, this is something that if you look at long-term trends and how the economy, the pension system, all this should be supported, there are very few ways to resolve this in light of low birth rates and other than essentially revisiting the migration agenda. I would say that in terms of the Gulf things, if I understand correctly, it might be that it's a difference between essentially labor migration, forced migration, and we need to be a bit mindful of that there. But I don't think there's anyone disagreeing that the Gulf does rely heavily on this imported labor, and has for decades essentially, and it doesn't look like it's going away despite nationalization programs and all this. So I think it's there to stay. And it's up to us to essentially ensure that it's done in a fair way and in a way that protects the rights of people going to work there. If that answers your question a bit.
Yeah, and I completely agree with what you both said. And I think that framework will apply it here as well. But I do think that's I did not study personally migration policies from Gulf countries. I just tried to read on that topic as much like everything I could find. And I think it's it's clear that the pattern is more about selecting what categories of migrants rather than so it's I do think it's also very political, obviously. And for instance, when in 2015, I think Saudi Arabia sort of like publicly defended itself for being accused of not taking in any Syrian refugees, and they explained that they actually did, but through the kafala system, not through like a refugee framework. So I also think that's interesting to see, because that's obviously a very political argument to make, but you can also, maybe see it through an economic perspective. I don't know. I would first think it's very political.
Thank you, Clothilde. I don't know, Jade, do you want to have maybe a last word? But I think there are no further questions unless you got another one in the
no, but
oh, it's fine.
I still have a question. Because
yeah, go ahead.
A question to everyone. It seems from all presentations that we're all obviously non-mainstream. If you look at the current economic, political arguments laid out in the media, but also in terms of the rise of the rhetoric that criminalizes the irregular and the dangerous and everybody that's different, and the fact that there is not a single discussion being happening about even within Arab countries also, and within the Gulf countries, about the costs and benefits of having better migratory management systems, of having more human rights for migrants. This discussion is nowhere to be found, even though the solution might seem kind of obvious and simple, is that you have to have a decent registration system for all migrants and kind of an even playing field. This is the major conclusion that we were having today, is that we have to treat people like human beings and have a sound system. How can researchers contribute to kind of changing this narrative in somewhat concrete manners? How do you translate your research into influencing or trying to influence public policy?
You asking one by one?
Yeah, whoever wants to answer.
I have, the reason why there is a tendency to blame migrants for everything is because migrants don't vote. And that's an easy way to scapegoat migrants for everything. And this is also even better if you are one of these populist right-wing parties, which can actually gather the benefits of blaming migrants for everything. So one way to act would be to allow migrants to vote at the local but also at the national level. So things would change substantially if there were this possibility, because they would be much easier for migrants to actually say, modify the political scene. Personally, what I do work with the European Commission and try to make them aware of these various nuances in the treatment of migrants we've been discussing today. So I have these projects with the European Union, especially DG Home, smuggling and trafficking, which is the one I've always been working with since when I was working for the UN in Cairo. So that's the only thing I can say. But honestly, the main issue is a political one. And until when migrants will not be able to vote, there's no way that things can change, because it's easier, even for parties on the left, to say, the things go wrong because there are too many migrants, and they will never be able to say, you're not saying the right thing. So that is my own personal position on it.
If I may add to this, it's a great question. I'm running an ERC now here in Glasgow, and on migration diplomacy, and one of the things that is where we're trying to get to is how to respond to coercion in migration diplomacy, right? So as Europe, how are we to respond to countries like Turkey or Belarus or Morocco or Libya whenever they try to use migrants or refugees in their foreign policy against Europe? And we are developing a theory to sort of try to understand this, but at the very bottom line, it is very simple, and it's just a matter of changing public perception on whether migrants and refugees are a net positive or not in terms of economies, societies, and the culture of Europe. So it would have been, it really is the best way to undercut any kind of coercion in migration diplomacy if we stop looking at migrants as threats, right? So it's as easy as this. But unfortunately, Jed, as I think you alluded to, policymakers don't really want to hear this kind of long-term solutions. They're more interested in, well, should we put up more barriers, or should we give more money to X, or should we load up Frontex's budget on this or whatever. So it's really, I think we're torn between short-term measures and a longer-term vision. And currently, I think we're just missing the vision in terms of where we're going as a European Union. So for us, the researchers, I think our duty is to keep going at it. And at some point, somebody will hear it, right? Hopefully. I don't know. But I'm an optimist in this kind of thing.
And what you're saying, they're not only a threat, but also they're a humanitarian problem to be resolved. And that's where you would find the politicians focusing on the negatives and the UN system focusing on providing aid, which is obviously not enough, right? I mean, there is a missing middle that is, I would think, easily occupied, but let's see. I mean, Dr. Facon, any?
Yeah, actually, so I completely agree with what Simona said on the migrant voting, and I think it's very striking how little of a debate it is. Like, I mean, in France, at least, it was announced by the former President Hollande, and in the end, he did not apply. I think he announced that migrants could vote for local elections in France, which really made sense. And then that was never implemented, and that did not even trigger debates, the fact that it was not implemented. But for the world of researcher, I do think that actually explaining those things to the public, the fact that the cost of benefits of having a better migration system, how little sense it makes the way money spent on borderization, etc. And well, there are initiatives. There is Desinfox migration in France, for instance, and I think I'm sure you can find something also in many other countries. So I do think this just basic work of informing and giving data, that's already in a way fighting against the current media climate. And I also think it's important to show how public actors who we might think are pro-migrant rights, NGOs, for instance, or some specific media, how they in a way play into the narratives of far-right movements. And for instance, I think all those labels, those categories that we assign to migrants, you're refugees or migrant, economic migrants, those, I'm not saying we should not use them, but we should really use them with more caution. So that's also something where I think a researcher could, sort of communicate more of their findings to the public. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Brachet.
Yeah, I agree with what has just been said. Obviously, I think we need to start from the facts for what they are, and seeing migration neither the problem to be solved nor as a solution to a problem, but simply as a social phenomenon, part of the history of humanity. We all know that, and we can try to understand this phenomenon. We can try to understand the driving forces, the practices, the dynamics of migration as such, but without preconceived ideas. And above all, without trying to make an objective, I think, without trying to make an objective cost-benefit assessment, which is always inevitably arbitrary, depending on the criteria we adopt and temporal, spatial, social limits we set ourselves. What does it mean to be beneficial to a group, to who, where, etc. So it's only by considering migration in this way as a simple social fact that it becomes possible to fully grasp, I think, the ideological dimension of migration policies. And for these policies are obviously never a natural or obvious or inevitable response to migratory phenomenon, but they simply always reflect societal choice, political choices. They reflect the type of society we want to promote. And this is why, even if we are, I think, mainstream within academia, I think we are not mainstream in the society, I agree with you, but in academia it's different. Still, it's very difficult to change policymakers' mindsets because it's a moral and ideological issue in many ways. So far, so surprising, you would say, yeah. But the problem arises when we realize that these policies or these policymakers and the policies they try to implement are based on fake vision of migratory flows, migratory dynamics. Or worse, when they, instead of assuming their ideological dimension, these policies seek to legitimate themselves by putting forward fake informations. And this is where I think we can intervene as scholars. And this is where we try to intervene with very limited success, I consider. That's the way I think we can keep working.
Great, thank you very much. We have a last comment by Simona Habib, who said that we talked about the migrants receiving countries. I would like us to reflect on the economics of migration from sending countries' perspective when it comes to migrant workers. I believe it's worth to understand what are the economic and political benefits for them so that they sometimes overlook abuses and violation of rights of their nationals abroad. It's a very interesting question, but I think you said, Isabel, that the economic aspect would be covered in the next roundtable, which I think would be, I hope it would cover this point. Of course, whenever we look at the economics, we look at the economics of the push and pull factors of the sending countries, the receiving countries, and the role of remittances, the migrant networks, the politics of migration. I mean, this whole domain is very, very varied and very interesting. So I'm sure this discussion will carry on for a long time.
Just a quick point on this, because I think it's a brilliant question, and we have overlooked this. I would just say that we're currently doing research on this in the sense that if you look at migration diplomacy negotiations, you'll see that actually there is leverage for weaker, ostensibly weaker states to rise up and to demand better human rights protection for their workers abroad. So we just published a paper on how the Philippines did this against Kuwait and the UAE. So they were able to implement a way for both of these states who had horrid abuses of Filipino workers, if you've been paying attention, they were able to lobby and secure better rights for these workers. So there is an element of research there in terms of how sending states or countries of origin can group together or can use migration diplomacy strategies to protect their citizens abroad. So I completely agree with Berna's point, but I would just add that it's not the asymmetry of power in terms of state power does not translate to an asymmetry of power in terms of migration diplomacy. So that would just be my 2 points there.
Okay. I think we'd reached probably the end of this seminar. Maybe Isabel, you want to say a few concluding words?
Yeah, thank you very much, all 5 of you, for having joined us today in this discussion. and for sharing with us your insights on this topic. Of course, as Gerasimos has said, there are probably some points that we've not addressed, some that were overlooked, and as the cycle continues, we will still have time to address also the question of the contribution of migrants to receiving states. So this will then basically be already the title also for the next roundtable that will take place on February 15th. And in the next roundtable will participate Dunya Ismaili, Paul Tabar, Orub Al-Abed, and Maya Shihade. So each and everyone will talk from a various angle. Dunya will take up mainly the Tunisian case. Paul Tabar is more looking at Lebanese migrants in Australia. Orub will talk a lot about the Syrian workers in Jordan, and whereas Maya, she will focus on the case of Syrian, but also Jordanian and Palestinian workers in Egypt. So we'll see what we can take away also from the next roundtable. In any case, it was very nice having you today, and there are a lot of ideas coming up and spreading up. So I hope we can make something out of it. Thanks a lot for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.